Hi, friends. Welcome to another episode of Making Spaces, a podcast about making space for people both literally and figuratively. I'm one of your co-hosts, Sarah, and this is
the other co-host, Josie.
We are really excited today to introduce a mutual friend, but a co-host. I don't know how to say it. Josie has another podcast, and this is her other co-host. So the person that Josie cheats on me with. So go ahead, Josie, introduce this fantastic lady.
Well, hello, friends. Today we have on the podcast Spencer Taylor, my co-host on our podcast, Speaking in Church, also available wherever you get your podcasts. She is not only one of my good, dear, amazing, lovely friends, she is also a human being who studied Christian ministries with a concentration in social services, which is very relevant to our podcast because, you know, she has the knowledge, the credentialing, as opposed to my bitchiness that accompanies her knowledge.
Oh my gosh. Did you know that was how she was going to introduce you, as the one who has the knowledge and credentials, and then she holds on to the bitchiness? She's like, my part, what I bring to this party is I bring some sass. Spencer, welcome. We're so excited to have you. So fun. I have a question that we're going to start with, because I know once we start talking, we're not going to stop, because we can.
Okay.
In church and anywhere else. The first question we ask everyone is, where is one of your favorite spaces and why?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Honored to be here. I love both of you women. You guys are awesome people. One of my favorite spaces is this space kind of changes, but one of my favorite spaces is at my mother's house. So not one particular house, but her home, wherever she resides. And I think that's because we moved around, not a lot, but enough where it's not like I was born and raised in one place. And every time my parents moved, and when I moved out to go to university, she always just told me, wherever I live, wherever I call home, like, you will have a home there. And I just feel that so much, because when I think of people making spaces, she's someone that I look up to in that. So yeah, her home, wherever that is one of my favorite spaces.
Ah, mama. I love that. So you two have a podcast. I'm going to be kind of interviewing both of you, but also you have a podcast. Tell me what the concept is. And please remember, not everyone who listens to the Making Spaces podcast comes from a Christian tradition. So you might have to explain why your podcast is sassy in nature. So go ahead, whoever wants to hop in and explain.
Spencer, I feel like the listeners hear me enough, so you can.
Okay. Yeah. So for those of you who haven't grown up in a Christian context, or maybe just really unfamiliar with it, Josie and I have a podcast called the Speaking in Church podcast. The name derives from a Bible verse that basically says women can't speak in the Bible when taken out of context. And so we created this podcast because over the past few years, we've gone through kind of this deconstruction, which is basically pulling apart things of our faith that we have struggled with, disagreed with, maybe evolved in. And we made this podcast to one, highlight other women's voices in that process, but also just highlight other people who have gone through similar things and kind of pick topics of what causes a lot of people to deconstruct. So really, it's kind of making a space for people to bring those challenging conversations and questions. And that's kind of why we did it. It started off with Josie and I used to have these conversations and be like, we should have other people, or how do we tell people about this? And then yeah, it just kind of came about in the middle of quarantine, and here we are almost a year later.
You know, isn't that crazy that something that started and that was birthed out of quarantine is like there are entire babies in our congregation that I've not met.
Yes, there are.
That's
like
wild.
entire like humans, like entire people were made. But also, this podcast was birthed during quarantine. Your podcast was birthed during quarantine, and it really is interesting to see too how all these things will shift and change as we move back into not I hate the new normal. What can we call it, guys?
The after.
AC.
I was gonna
after COVID.
Yeah.
Yes.
AC after COVID.
I love it.
Perfect. So as you're thinking about this idea of women and making space It's really interesting to me to hear both of you come from very different experiences of mother figures making or not making space, right?
Yes.
Which created for both of you a desire for not only to make space, but to highlight other space makers, right? So either lack thereof or experiencing it well has made you create space for others. When did both of you grow up in traditions where women weren't leaders within your church community? Officially leaders? I did say.
Well, I did, for sure.
I became a Christian leader in life, like as a teenager. And so, yeah, I would say, it was a non-denominational church that women were not allowed to be leaders. So, yeah, when I said I wanted to go study ministry, there was a couple people that were like egalitarian in personal belief that were on staff that were like, yeah, like that's cool. But as a whole of the church, it was a big no-no. And I had a lot of pushback from people. So.
Yeah, I remember I didn't really realize because I moved to America when I was in high school, and I didn't really think about the fact that I didn't see that many female pastors around me, and particularly because I was from a family where women and like equal that just was. And so I remember being feeling like I got my call to ministry and telling this girl that was part of the Baptist Student Union in college, and she looked at me and she was like, no. And I was so confused by, I said, I feel like I'm being called to ministry and I'm really excited about it. And I got into this like kind of hard grad school to get into. And she went, no, which I find
just
really
straight to your face said no.
No. And she's like, women you shouldn't know. Like it really, and I find it, and I'm wondering what both of you think about the fact that oftentimes the ones who are prohibitive of women moving into spaces that have been male dominated are other women. Have you guys, as you've been working on this podcast, talked through any of that?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I feel like I talk about my mother all the time.
It's okay. That's fine. It's like it's fine.
Yeah. But both of my parents is actually very interesting. Both of my parents were very adamant about all of their children going to college and being educated and studying and all this stuff. And then as soon as I was in college, they were upset that I wasn't dating and that I wasn't finding a husband, because ultimately my purpose in life was, to be a wife and a mother, and that's it. And look, then why the hell am I paying $160,000 for a degree?
Whoa.
Yeah, APU is very expensive. It's probably more now, I'm assuming, whatever.
Probably, yeah.
But yeah, so my mother has always been very adamant about her daughter not being me.
In that she just was like, you've got to have some sort of like, I hate the word, but like, so friends who are not from a Christian tradition, there's this idea of covering. And what covering means is like, almost like the person who like you can do something if you have this covering, if you have this person, right? So
if you have a husband umbrella.
Right. A husband umbrella, then you are welcome in these spaces. And I think it sounds like your mom was like, yeah, no, I want you to be educated, but also you have to like bring the dude into the thing.
Well, yeah. And I think being a avid feminist and being somebody who does not want to birth a child is my parents' worst nightmare, because, a feminist hates men, allegedly, and a feminist is like a woman who thinks that she's better than man when man is supposed to be the head of the household and the head of humanity. And they didn't see the equality and they do see it, they just don't believe in it. And they think that I'm not fulfilling my God-given purpose as a woman and as a person with a womb if I don't birth a child, which, whatever. Also, I'm like a loudmouth, and that doesn't really jive with their whole young Christian female thing. And I don't like to cook. I don't like to clean. So I'm not a good Christian.
What about you, Spencer? What was the modeling for you? Because if you didn't come into this till you were in high school. So does that mean your family of origin was not Christian?
So my dad was raised Catholic and my mom was raised Baptist, but when they kind of had their kids, and so I have a yours, mine, and ours family. My dad had a son, my oldest brother. My mom had a son, the next oldest, and they met and then had me and my sister. But we were all raised together, which I know is very, very rare for people that have half siblings, especially the fact that my dad has always had custody. I realize the privilege and how rare that is to grow up in that household with my brother. But that was a dynamic that, one, just having a blended family is not often seen in Christian families. Number two, my mom has always been the breadwinner, kind of always will be kind of thing. Again, not often seen in Christian households. And so when we started going to church, there was a pushback because I remember learning, similar to what Josie said, learning about the husband being the head of the house and making these decisions, even talking about things like finances or like providing for the family, like the definition of providing being sort of a breadwinner, like bringing money and being able to take care. When I saw my dad as a provider because my dad was a stay-at-home dad. He did work for a while when I was growing up, but he basically went to work while I was at school and was always home when I came home, off every weekend, coached every sport, took us to every recital, whatever. And so that was a really big pushback for me, but also a little bit different than Josie. I feel like I'm the balance of, I wanted to do these things that women weren't technically allowed to do, but I also have a desire to birth a family. I really want to be a mother, both whether that be through childbearing or adoption, foster care, all that kind of thing. I love to cook. I'm very domesticated. So
domestic. You're not a cat.
Okay, you know what I mean. Like, that's just what they say, like, oh, domesticated. I just think of that so bad. I think of that Robin Thicke song, like, they try to domesticate you.
Oh.
Yes, that's what I think of. Anyways.
I don't hate that song, guys.
I don't either. And I
don't
feel
either.
Does that make me a bad feminist? Maybe. But anyway, so yeah, I think which is funny because I think that's why Josie and I mesh so well, because a lot of core things we agree on, but then there's other things that we don't agree on for silly reasons that we like push back on. Yeah. And I think that's really healthy though, because it reminds me not to take things too seriously. And I think when we were talking about how, oh, Spencer brings the credential and I bring the sass, I think sometimes Josie reminds me that it's okay to raise my voice, because I think sometimes I do act a little too meek or whatever you want to call it because of just ingrained patriarchy, purity culture, all of these other things. So
I think there's also something to be said on the flip side of that. And something that I think about often when I think about this, even under the umbrella of feminist or someone who is female positive or whatever it might be, a lot of times there's assumptions made about who you should be from that perspective. Like as a woman who is going to be pro-woman, for women, then there's almost a reverse shaming of should you feel because of your own desires and wants and needs, right? Like this is what I actually want, then somehow you lose the legitimacy within that. Like if we're really going to make space for people, we have to make space for who that person actually is, not who we think that definition looks like. Like I think about how many times, because I'm the same as you. This is why we're all probably friends with Josie is my balls. I tend to, I'm very, I would almost say, stereotypical female in that I'm relational forward, right? Same, and I don't know if that's learned behavior or if I was just, that's just who I am. And I will do anything to not sometimes cause the waves that sometimes need to happen. And I think it's so helpful to be reminded, like, you don't always have to be that, but I think we have to make space for a feminist to look like Josie, for a feminist to look like Sarah, for a feminist to look like Spencer. And it's so often that it has to look a certain way. And one of the things I love about doing this show is that we meet so many people that fall into categories that I think we have so many assumptions about, and then discovering like the thing about them is sort of this openness and open-handedness of how they hold on to whatever that identity might be,
Yeah, I think that's just exactly what you said, because when I kind of started this journey of later in high school realizing, hey, I think there's a call to ministry that needs to be explored. And when I received that pushback, I instantly was like, well, then I need to go for it all the way. And sometimes in bad ways of changing who I was because I thought I needed to be a certain kind of person to be a feminist or to be pro-women. Because I thought I couldn't desire to be married. I couldn't desire a family, or I couldn't desire to be a stay-at-home mom or anything like that, because I thought that negated the like progression that I wanted for women, especially in the church. But exactly what you said, the more I realized that there were spaces for both, and the true meaning of like, what does it mean to be pro-women, to be a feminist, is if you want to be a stay-at-home mom, be a hell of a good one. Put everything you have into it. And if you want to go to work every day, then be really good at your job and put everything you have into it. And supporting each other in those endeavors, even if they're different than your own desires. I think that is exactly what you said, of just, it's so important to have that space for people, or else we can't flourish in the way we want to.
Yeah, it's interesting how we even make boxes for ourselves. And I think in the last year or so, I've been seeing more and more women recognizing this thing that we've done, where we've become the biggest pushback on other women, and policing other women, and it's such a great distraction, right? Isn't it? It's a great distraction. Like I'm overwhelmed by, someone posted yesterday this like super weird TikTok where I believe she's an ex-porn star. I'm not sure. But she's talking about how Christian women need to like really think about whether or not their sexual needs are being met by their husbands, because the porn industry will if you don't. And it was basically like this super like, if your husband's watching porn, that's because you got. And all of a sudden I was like, this is a woman who is buying into this narrative that is it's a, ex porn star ministry thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to like, now this is a woman's problem that her husband is objectifying other women because you haven't done your quote unquote duty. And I just thought that to me is way worse than some dude getting on TikTok and being like, satisfy your wife. Because it feels like a betrayal of ourself. And then I've also on the flip side seen, one woman going off on women who shave their arms. Guys, I hate body hair. I'm never going to like it. It's never going to be a statement for me. I just don't like it. I don't like it on other people. Don't like it on myself. It's just, and that is, maybe that's ingrained. I don't know. But to police people in that way, one way or the other, feels very much like not making space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, so the idea of like it becomes a women problem when it's like not. Josie and I had talked about that on one of our episodes. We talk about human trafficking, and our guest, he literally says, he's like, this issue exists because of the desires of men. And until we establish that and stop making it about other things, like the problem's never going to be fixed. And mind you, that was a man saying that. And for a man to say that was profound to me, because exactly what you said, so many times, whether it's purity culture or even just society in general, making it a woman problem and putting women against each other when the actual problem is not being addressed.
Right. Like in the instance of human trafficking, people want to say like, oh, young women, don't go out and dress provocatively because somebody's going to snatch you off the street, instead of saying, hey, maybe we should address the fact that people are, and mostly men, are snatching women off the street. Like that's, yeah.
Well, and using it as I recently saw someone write this whole thing about like, you guys are getting all mad about all this stuff, but you're not mad about human trafficking. And it's like, whoa, now we're pitting like topics against each other. Yeah, right.
Yes.
And it's like, those things actually have zero to do with each other. And I can be both profoundly upset that Asian Americans are being victimized, as I am about those things are human issues. They're not, they're not against each other. It's not like there's like only so much room for issues. And that's the scarcity mindset and the fear mindset that I think we're sold constantly, particularly women, right? Are sold that fear.
I think, so what's interesting about that too, of people trying to put against Asian hate and human trafficking, when unfortunately Asian women work a lot of survival jobs that feed into that feed into the human trafficking or other sex work industries. And so no, if you really cared about that, then you should care about this too, because these women put themselves in danger just to survive in a country that's supposed to be the greatest country in the world. I'm sorry. Like we really need to address this.
Yeah, it's a false narrative too. And it goes from big things like that to like little things like, where you felt like you had to be a certain person to fit into this category. What that is this like, language of scarcity. Like if there's only so many positions for women, so in order to fill that position or become that thing, you're gonna have to be a certain thing. Like I can even tell you guys the advice I used to get when I went into ministry back in the dark ages, before you guys were walking. The advice I would get from other women was actually some of the most damaging things I've heard. And it had nothing to do with them trying to damage me. It was that was their experience. And I think the lesson or the words of like, hey, there's actually way more space than there isn't. There's an abundance of space. There's enough space for Spencer to be the person who can make pasta from scratch, and for me to be someone who just killed an entire thing of basil because I don't know how to caregive for plants. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I've cooked before, but mostly I'm good at making reservations. Like there's just like, and both of us are wholly female. If that is our definition of female, I mean, there's just this huge thing. And I think if we can distract people with making it seem like, okay, you got to be, there's not enough space, then it stops us from actually paying attention to the things around us, like that are problematic, and holding us down, I think.
Yeah, I think that's why I love the podcast that Spencer and I have together, because we kind of tackle these topics. We have our guests choose whatever topic they want to talk about, which is helpful because then they can be very passionate about what we're talking about. And we talk to very normal people that are just that we know, some that we didn't, whatever. And they pick a topic and we talk about it in relation to, Christianity and evangelical culture. And we don't shy away from calling attention to the things that have hurt us, but we also don't not talk about the things that we thought were funny and fun. Like we have a whole episode dedicated to youth group lock-ins and how they were fun and ridiculous and what the hell was they? Why did we do that?
I think my boyfriend and I in high school, we went to lock-ins together, and they were we got in trouble for holding hands across the aisle or whatever.
Across the aisle, how dramatic.
It was, but why did we do that? Why, like, this is not the Titanic. There was in no way was one of those pews going to sink and we not see each other. Plus, we dated for 3.5 years, guys. Like, we were together a lot. I don't know why I was like, if we're going to be in the same room, we're going to need to touch. So weird.
Yeah, and I think it's important, like even the juxtaposition of our personalities is that I like to say that Spencer has more knowledge than me, and she does. But I know some things. I mean, I know quite a few things.
Josie knows a lot of things. She just likes to sell herself short.
It's true.
It's called humility, Spencer. I'm working on it. Okay. But she is like, I am the more aggressive, more controversial, more confrontational person, and Spencer is working on it. But she also pushes me to chill the fuck out.
She pushes me to chill the fuck out.
And I think that's also important.
I mean, just if you're into the Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram 4, so I'm always in my feels, and sometimes Josie needs to get in her feels, and that's something that I remind her constantly.
Who are you, my therapist?
I mean, I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, so I'm often in my feels as well, but it's also like I don't know my own feels, like I'm in other people's feels. I'm outwardly feeling, and yes. I'm someone who is called an empath. So I like literally feel your feelings. And so if someone doesn't know how to feel their feelings, then I will feel their feelings for them. Don't worry. But I think there's something to be said about people who can, I don't know, help us, can be the yin to our yang. My friend Kevin is very much my yin to my yang. We'll have to, they've been on this many times, but and Josie, even in this show, like people all the time tell me like, it's so fun to hear someone who's very different than Josie.
His book is their book is just right here.
It's so good.
Just a side note. So the very first time that Josie talked to Kevin, I fangirled a little because I have been a big fan of theirs for a while. And Josie was like, I don't really know a lot. Like, can you explain who they are? And I was like, Josie, what?
So our podcast is joining this media group, and it's really fun to me to like have Josie involved, and just it's just fun to me. But she was saying that like a lot of her friends are like, oh my gosh, that person.
Yes.
But we don't really like, these are just the humans that are in my life. And I don't really think of them as like Christian celebrity. And it's the weirdest or like post-Christian celebrity or like whatever. I think the weirdest experience, and Josie, you're going to experience it when we go to Wild Goose. Going to Wild Goose with my friends who had a podcast called The Liturgist, and they were doing their thing. These are like my friends. So I'm not aware of the fandom around this stuff, because when you really do help people out of really tight and tough spots, it's a different kind of fandom. It's not like oh my gosh, you're so hot, or oh my gosh, I want to consume you. It's almost like, oh my gosh, you've helped. It's like if I were to see Brene Brown, I would be like, oh, I don't even need to say anything to you. I just need you to know. Like, I don't need anything from you in this moment. And I think a lot of people with this deconstructing community feel that way. And so they just want to, that's all people want to say. And they're very, very respectful. But it was crazy going to this conference with thousands of people. And I'm just walking in with my friends, not realizing the reaction that people have to them. Because I'm used to being with them in LA, where we're walking by actual celebrities all the time. Yeah. And so it was so strange to have like people like lose their words. Like, Science Mike, you don't understand. I couldn't be me until I knew you. It's like the craziest. It's a very different kind of celebrityness. And I recognize that that's how Kevin can be experienced too. But like for Josie, I mean, she just knows Kevin is like one of my besties.
And so Josie and I have had that conversation continually for exactly what you said of Mike's book changed my life when I was studying ministry. And so I remember reading that as a junior in college and feeling so much freedom from it. And same thing of the second time we went to our church in Costa Mesa, Scott Erickson was there and he did the sermon. And I literally sobbed in my car on the way home because it was people
I'm not laughing at you, I promise.
But it's just exactly what you said, Sarah, is people that led me through a wilderness that felt lonely, and to see them in person and know that they're just regular human beings was so freeing, because it exactly what you said. It wasn't like, oh my God, I just met Taylor Swift and she'll never know who I am. I messaged Scott literally that day and said, I haven't walked in a church building in over a year. And I just heard you give this sermon and I sobbed, and I just want to thank you for that. And like instantly responded and like have a conversation with them and know that they're a real human was so healing for me. And so, like when Josie and I started doing this podcast and she started doing the podcast with you, it was this weird like bridge of like my normal life meets these places that I thought nobody knew about. But no, these are real people that know exactly what I was going through. And that's exactly why we made our podcast, because there's so many of us in this deconstruction era that feel like we're in these dark places that nobody knows about, when we're all just normal people living life, asking these questions, wondering if anybody else wants to talk about them.
Yeah. And there's that, the reality of sometimes my own spirituality is difficult or complicated or damaged. And I think for me, even hearing you guys say those things, like I honestly say there is something about who God has placed in my life and then allowed me to place in other people's lives. Because when Mike wrote that book, I mean, I'm the tiny pastor in the book, right? And you read that book, and I remember I was at a coffee shop called Hidden House I was working on my sermon, and my computer just kept jacking up, and there was this kid in there, and I was like, ah, and he was like, let me fix your computer. And then he saw on my computer was like a PDF of Mike's book, and Mike's book had already come out, but he saw the little PDF and he was like, why do you have that little PDF? I was like, oh, it's a book that my friend wrote. And then the guy all of a sudden got this look on his face, and he looks at me and he goes, are you nose ring Sarah? And everybody around there just turned their head and looked at me. And I was like, because I am not a celebrity. So I was like, yeah. What do you mean? And he was like, I listened to the Pete Holmes show, and Pete Holmes is this comedian, and he had Mike on, and Mike had talked about the tiny pastor who welcomed him back, and Pete's response was like, Little Nose Ring Sarah. So then they, after that, referred to me as Little Nose Ring Sarah. But you don't realize that, like, the space you make for people. So for me, my relationship with Mike was just, that's just what you do when you care and love someone and you feel like God. And I feel like God has really given me these people in my life, and I don't always know why or the timing. And for me, it feels it's always been relational. Like why the heck are we invited into that podcast group? Well, because I know half of them, and they just decided that would be fun. And I think being open to that is also because they know the space is just always expanding, and I'm always going to want to bring along people like Josie and you. And just, I think there's this beauty in how do we treat our relationships, whether they are as famous as my friend Scott, who, I mean, Scott and I met literally because we were like, I was speaking at an event and he was like going down the like stairwell, and I was just riding down it as well. And he was wearing a t-shirt of his own artwork, and it was my favorite art piece, not realizing that he was the artist that created it. And I was like, that's my favorite art piece. And my friend goes, that's your favorite artist. And I mean, that's how we met. And that was years and years ago. And it just takes like the reality of like, you're right. If you can say me too in these spaces and places, and, or even say, I just am curious about you and where you're coming from and who you are. And I think we have to be honest about the fact that people's work has been helpful. And I think it's a different kind of celebrity, like you said. And I love that you guys have created, because I know there's people who listen to you guys and it's helped them. Okay, well, now there's a Josie and a Spencer. You know, there's a Enneagram 8 out there being like, I'm not that weird.
Yeah, you guys are so wholesome, because me not caring is just me just not giving a shit about people. I'm just like, well, you're gonna die too, bitch. So
but I think that's important, because I think you bring a different level of humanity to it. You even emphasize more of that they're just normal people. Because when I talk about Science Mike, and I'm like telling my friends, you should read this book, people who've never listened to the Liturgist, or people who have never, I actually, before I started listening to the Liturgist, I listened to Ask Science Mike. And so before, like, people who don't even know who that is, they're like, Spencer, I don't care. I don't want to read this book. And it's heartbreaking to me. But then there's people like you who are just like, listen, like, I'm not saying it's not a good book. I just like, they're just another human. And sometimes I need that. So I appreciate the perspective that you have about it.
Yeah, it's just a different balance. And different things are, for me, but also the reality is too, what I realized too from them. So last night I was out and somebody recognized me from an event a long, long time ago. And it was a beautiful moment. And also weird, right? COVID. So strange to be like, hey, oh my gosh, years. It's been years. But what I realized, and they shared with me, hey, this is something that you did years ago, changed my life. And to hold that is a different way than like this song that you sang and pelvic thrusted on was really like powerful and moving. But I think there is, it's a humility to be reminded, like sometimes we forget that the work that we do is space making for people to find their own purpose and passion. And I think it's great when people tell you you're doing great, because we don't often do it. And like, I want to be everyone's cheerleader and thank them for their work, right?
I think that, go for it.
I was just going to say that in our podcast, I think that's one of the reasons why it's very important to me to always have normal people on, like our friends. I'm sure we'll have famous friends of Sarah's on the podcast eventually.
Famous friends of Sarah.
The only place I meet famous people. The only people.
A new segment.
I know. But just because, like, it's easy to have the famous person come on. It's easy to have Science Mike come on and talk about all things existential and cool, right? But then I have a normal person come on and be like, hey, look at this. This idiot next door also has the same thoughts that you do. So, you know, keep thinking the thoughts, not to call the guy next door an idiot. I'm sure they're fine. But
it makes the conversation less intimidating. It makes people feel like that they're invited into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that So I've been really into Rob Bell lately because for so long he was off limits to me.
APU, baby.
And so the big thing of, you know, a lot of TikTokers I follow have been talking about, and the reoccurring theme that's coming up is everything is spiritual. And even just in this conversation. Okay, so that like keeps coming up and people are talking about, oh, like Rob Bell, like read like this book and all that kind of stuff. And so like that's been sitting with me so deeply. And even in this conversation, like things are connecting of, I had mentioned to Sarah before of I heard Sarah years ago on the Homebrewed Christianity podcast and had never even like had a second thought about it. And then while at APU, simultaneously learning more and more about scripture and more about Christianity than I had ever known, simultaneously being dipped in evangelical culture that I wasn't dipped in because I didn't grow up in the Christian faith, while simultaneously deconstructing was wild. And so on Facebook and Instagram and with my APU friends was like, yeah, evangelical culture, I'm here for it. And then secretly on Twitter that I didn't let really anybody follow me on was following so many people having these conversations. And that's how I found Sarah again of, hey, I saw somebody tag her and I went to her website and I found the church and I listened to a sermon and was like, Josie, this is 10 minutes from our house. We should go there.
And Spencer is the reason why this podcast exists right now, everybody.
Inception.
Okay, but again, with the everything is spiritual, Josie comes with me. The first time we went, I'm not going to lie, it was a little weird, Sarah. And I was like, what the frick? I'd never been to any place like that. And we left and I was trying to play it cool. And later I texted Josie after I cried about it and was like, I really liked that. Can we go back? And Josie was like, yeah, like I was into it too. And then all of a sudden the church job opened up and like all of these things came into play because of something that I had read on Twitter. And I don't care what you say, that's spiritual to me. Everything about that was a God moment. Everything about that was divine. And the thought of, you know, I think social media is trash, but I also think social media is divine. And so we live in this reality of this conversation couldn't have happened without years of random connections, I heard Sarah on a podcast one time and I heard Science Mike on a podcast one time because he's literally the person that tagged you that led me to that sermon. And so it's so many little things like that I'm like, guys, here we are, the year of our Lord 2021, in the middle of a global pandemic, having this conversation because everything is spiritual. And I believe that in every core of who I am.
Yeah, I was in Alabama last week and it was great and wonderful. And because I'm going through the job transition and having a lot of like, I love creating space. How do I do this? What is this going to look like? I'm having all these things. And so years ago, Science Mike became Science Mike because we were all in a room. It's like 8 years ago or 9 or 10 years ago. And there was 50 of us with Rob Bell and Rob had just left his job and he like was having these creative sessions and we were in it. And there was a girl named Sarah, not me, another Sarah, and her and I connected and we met Mike and then we all started hanging out like all the time. And we were all going through huge life transitions. Sarah is the yin to my yang. I'm the the YouTube basically. Like she works at Amazon. She's in finance. She's like tough. She's smart. We both went to Duke, but she went to Duke. Well, I was at Duke for theology. She was at Duke for business school. Okay. We never met each other. We both grew up with brothers that are exactly the same age difference than us. We're the exact same age. We were in the same sorority in undergrad, but we were at two different schools. We both studied, like, it's crazy, but she's very like tough, but she's amazing. And she's always grounded me when I'm feeling like everything is falling apart, but we've lost contact. She got married, had 2 kids. And it was really hard for me, if I'm honest, because here was someone that was single with me all through my, 30s. And then she got married and had kids really quick. And it was like, all of a sudden our lives are very different. And so that's been a pain point for me, especially because she's really close to my best guy friend. And so it's been hard, right? So I'm in the airport in Atlanta, flying back home, feeling all the feels. You know what I mean? Like feeling all the feels. And I'm sitting with my spiked seltzer water, just sitting there. hydrating while also having a little alcohol. And
Hydrating.
I look up and Sarah is standing there. And we both just look at each other and I go, Sarah? And she goes, Sarah? And she sits down. She's like, I don't even know why I walked over here. I was just looking for food, I guess. And like, then her and I went and got dinner and we sat and talked for an hour about things that only I could talk to her about. And like, she understands me in ways that I can't even understand myself sometimes. And both of us just kept saying, what just happened? We experienced a divine moment. And it has been so fascinating to me how when I'm willing to say yes to things that seem a little bit like, even going to that conference felt very opening and whatever. But when I do that, where all these other things are. And that's why I think the lessons of like you guys even saying yes to doing your podcast, that's, literally Josie's like, hey, I'm doing another podcast. I'm like, Josie, you've never done a podcast before. You're like, yeah, I guess I do podcasts now, which is a very Josie attitude, by the way. The rest of
100%.
I can't do this. Josie's like, I'll do 2 of them. But I think it's opened, right? I feel like it's opened up conversations with people or just this thing that you put out in the world. And someone may not even have listened to the podcast they need to hear that you guys have done. They might hear you on this and then go back and listen. And there's going to be like a thing that gives them ultimately more freedom and more space and more, and then they're going to go, it's like all this pay it forward stuff. So it's so fun to watch. I'm glad you guys are doing it.
Me too.
Thanks.
It's fun.
It reminds me.
Sorry.
No, I see Josie likes to talk shit when me and my feels Enneagram 4. I'm like, it just reminds me again that I'm not alone on this journey and that there's people, normal people, just like Josie said, everyday people that want to have conversations that I think are really important and I wish people were having more. So
yeah. If that's to say, if anybody's listening that wants to be on that podcast, let us know. We're looking for a conservative person. I really want to talk to a Trump supporter on my podcast.
Oh, do you?
I really do, but they're probably not down. We've come to realize this because I have Trump supporting friends who have probably maybe listened. None of them will take me up on the offer. I think I'm too intimidating. Not to toot my own
have
horn.
Spencer do it. You should ask them, Spencer.
I should ask them? Why?
Yeah, you're
Spencer
a little
doesn't
softer.
have Trump supporting friends.
That's not true. Actually, I have where I grew up is very red. Okay.
Yes. Ask them.
Yeah, I guess I could ask them. I think I also one of the big things, just because I'm gonna plug us, if you are a LGBTQ affirming youth pastor, that's been requested.
Oh, yeah.
That's been requested by people that listen so many times. And we've had some people that like just missed connections. It's never worked out, but I feel like we just need that to happen. So if you're listening, you are one, you know someone, holla at us.
I'll send you a list.
Yes.
Oh, heck yeah.
Famous friends from Sarah.
Famous youth pastor friends. Shut up. I could talk to both of you forever. I actually kind of forgot we were recording. That happens all the time. Spencer, I would love for you to tell me, is there like, when you think about what's been space making for you, or when you think about making space for other people, it's like one tangible thing. If someone was going to do something different today, what would it be?
This is going to come out of left field because I feel like we could have a whole other conversation about this, but this is just a life that I live daily. And when I was thinking about coming on this podcast, I kind of knew you would ask this question because I listened to your show. And the number one thing I came back to was make space for your fat friends.
Yes.
And for those of you that don't know me, I am a plus size woman, have been for as long as I can remember. And just like everything else about me, that has shaped who I am just as much as me, a woman having a boy's name, has shaped who I am. So yeah, make space for your fat friends and understand that we're at a point where what you think is the bare minimum is actually not even the bare minimum. And I just need you to take that seriously.
Okay, talk a little bit about making space for your fat friends. By the way, saying the word fat friends makes me really uncomfortable because I'm like,
okay, so that's like the first thing of just the realizing that the word fat, like people have used the word fat against me my whole life when all you're doing is describing me. You know what I I see a dog on the street that's fat, I say, look at that fat dog. Isn't he cute? Like,
Yeah.
How come for a dog that's not contradictory? A fat dog can be cute, but for a fat woman to be sexy, to be cute, to be desirable, to be just a normal fucking human. I dropped the F-bomb because I'm that passionate about it.
I love it.
How come that is a contradictory? And so again, yeah, saying fat friends, don't be scared of that. It's like, so many people are afraid to say things like, oh, my Black friends. Like, there's no reason to be afraid of that. There's no reason to be afraid of saying my fat friend. And there's no reason to be afraid of when I say I'm fat, you to be like, oh my gosh, no, you're not. Yes, I am. I know I am. Like, you don't have to say things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And my biggest thing of, again, like, everybody's on a body positive journey. Everybody is trying to be mindful of themselves. And I understand that, but just reminding yourself of, if you have a lot of negative self-talk about yourself and you know that your friend is fatter than you and you constantly say things about how fat you are, remember how damaging that can be. And again, there's grace for everybody, because I have friends that really just need a vent because they've gained weight in quarantine and they just want to tell me how fat they are. I acknowledge that. That's valid. I want to be there for that. But also understanding that the way we talk about ourselves is a reflection of the people around us. And I don't think people take that into consideration enough. Even me as a fat person, sometimes I say things about myself that I project onto other people when I don't intentionally do so. And I try to change that every day. So
I love it because it's a reclaiming of a word. Like, so queer used to be like a problematic word. And then those who are queer reclaiming the word queer. And then it took those of us who are outside of that community a while to take it on. And so I think the hesitancy that I have to use it is like the reality that my brain goes cognitive dissonance. Fat has always been a judgment instead of a statement. And so
that is a neutral word.
Right. And I think that's the joy of learning from other people and learning from your fat friends and making space. I love that. Thank you. So again, we could go on for hours. You're just an incredible, you both are. It's so fun to talk to you. So where can we find your podcast, ladies? And then where can we find you, Spencer, if you have your own side gigs you're doing?
Yeah. I'm not like an influencer, but I like people to follow me. You can find me on Instagram at Spence Rose. I'm sure they'll tag it. But Sarah was talking about cooking. I do a lot of cooking on there. I have a little Instagram cooking show. I talk about something I didn't talk about on this podcast because, again, we could talk forever. I talk a lot about my journey with mental health. I have bipolar 2 disorder. It's another big part of who I am. Like I said, I'm a fat woman. Talk a lot about that. And then you can find our podcast, Speaking in Church podcast. You can find us on Instagram at Speaking in Church. We'll tag that as well. Don't follow us on Twitter. I'm trying to revamp that. Twitter and I have a hard time.
Our little podcast media group that we're part of, they openly mock my inability to tweet. But have you noticed? I've been trying to tweet more, Josie.
I have noticed.
I've been trying.
I am so proud of you.
Actively have to try to tweet because people, is that how you say it? Do you say tweet?
Tweet?
Yeah.
Okay. I just turned red because all of a sudden I was like, is that not how you say it? Anyway, they would post things about me and I wouldn't know. And so now I'm at least once a day. I'm trying to at least once a day go into Twitter. But Josie, where can people find us?
They can find us on Instagram at makingspacespodcast. If you want to recommend some of your own personal famous friends, you can email us at makingspacespodcast@gmail.com. We don't have a Twitter. I don't got time for that.
Ain't nobody got time.
Yeah. Find us.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and join us next week because we will be
saving a space for you.
Bye. I'm gonna stop this.